The crashing waves of the coastal shores offered a much-needed rhythm to calm Amara's racing mind. At 30 years old, she had built a corporate empire that demanded her constant attention, and her current business expansion had brought her all the way to South Korea. For the past 2 weeks, her world had been a relentless whirlwind of boardrooms, intense negotiations, and endless handshakes. Now, with the contracts finally signed and the massive deal secured, she sought the quiet solace of a secluded stretch of beach just outside the bustling city. The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in deep shades of violet and burnt orange. Amara walked barefoot along the shoreline, letting the cool water wash over her toes. The sea breeze felt liberating, carrying away the heavy expectations of her professional life. She closed her eyes, taking a deep breath of the salty air, feeling entirely alone in the best possible way. The ocean has a way of absorbing whatever burdens we bring to it. The voice was deep, resonant, and carried a smooth cadence that made Amara open her eyes and turn around. Standing a few paces away was a man who seemed to command the very air around him. He looked to be around 50, with sharp, aristocratic features, silver threading through his dark hair, and dark eyes that held a lifetime of unspoken authority. There was a dangerous stillness to him, a quiet power that usually made people look away, yet when his gaze met hers, it was surprisingly gentle. Amara didn't know it then, but this was Tae-jin, a man whose name was whispered with both reverence and fear in the underground world. He was the head of the largest syndicate in the country, a CEO of shadows and empires. Yet, standing here on the sand, he was captivated by the poised, beautiful black woman who looked out at his country's sea as if she owned the horizon. "It does," Amara replied, her voice steady and warm, refusing to be intimidated by his intense presence. "It reminds me of how small my problems actually are." Tae-jin stepped closer, though he kept a respectful distance. He had noticed her from the cliffside terrace of his private estate earlier. He had seen a lot of things in his half-century of life, but the quiet strength and grace she exuded had drawn him down to the shoreline. His security detail lingered far in the distance, mere shadows against the rocks, completely unnoticed by Amara. "You are a long way from home," Tae-jin observed, walking slowly in tandem with her as she resumed her stroll. "Business or pleasure?" "A bit of both now that the business is concluded," Amara smiled, a genuine, radiant expression that made Tae-jin's heart perform a rhythm it had long forgotten. "I came to close a merger. Now I am simply enjoying the peace before my flight back." They walked together as the twilight settled around them. For two people who had just met, the conversation flowed with an effortless rhythm. Amara found herself intrigued by his sharp intellect and the profound, worldly way he spoke about life, architecture, and the history of the tides. Tae-jin, in turn, was entirely disarmed by her brilliant mind, her effortless humor, and the fearless way she looked him directly in the eyes. In his world, everyone wanted something from him or feared what he could take. Amara simply saw him as a man on the beach. By the time the stars began to pierce the night sky, they had stopped walking and were simply standing by the water, locked in a conversation that neither wanted to end. "I know you are scheduled to leave," Tae-jin said, his voice lowering, carrying a magnetic pull. "But if your schedule allows, I would be honored to show you the true beauty of this country, beyond the boardrooms." Amara looked at him, feeling a sudden, undeniable spark. It was entirely out of character for her to change her meticulously planned itinerary for a stranger, but there was a quiet, protective sincerity in his eyes that made her pause. "I think," Amara said softly, a playful smile touching her lips, "I could delay my flight for a few days." Tae-jin's lips curved into a rare, breathtaking smile. It was the beginning of an intersection between two entirely different worlds, bound together by the sudden, inescapable pull of destiny. The few days Amara had promised to stay quickly dissolved into a mesmerizing week. Tae-jin proved to be an unparalleled host, guiding her through a side of South Korea that no tourist ever saw. They walked through ancient, mist-shrouded temple grounds before dawn, drank rare teas in centuries-old pavilions, and dined in exclusive, unmarked establishments where the chefs and patrons alike bowed in deep, silent reverence the moment Tae-jin entered the room. Amara, perceptive and sharp, easily noticed the subtle ring of security that always hovered just out of sight and the weight his presence carried. She knew he was a man of immense, perhaps dangerous power, but with her, he was nothing but attentive, soft-spoken, and remarkably tender. By the time she finally had to return to her company, an unspoken bond had cemented between them. They spent hours on the phone across different time zones, the formidable Mafia boss and the brilliant CEO finding refuge in each other's voices. It wasn't long before Tae-jin, unwilling to endure the distance any longer, planned a stunning trip for them. He chartered his private jet to sweep her away to an exclusive, breathtaking private island in the Maldives. When they arrived, the beauty of the place was staggering. Their secluded villa sat suspended over the crystal-clear turquoise water, completely isolated from the rest of the world. For the first time since they met, there were no bodyguards, no board members, and no distractions. It was just the two of them, surrounded by the endless ocean and the warm tropical breeze. That evening, after a private dinner prepared by a world-class chef who discreetly left them to their solitude, the atmosphere shifted. The playful banter of the afternoon gave way to a thick, magnetic tension. The island was quiet, the only sound being the gentle lap of waves against the wooden stilts of the villa. Tae-jin reached out, his warm, strong hand gently pulling Amara close as they stood on the moonlit terrace. His touch was intoxicating, sending a cascade of heat through her veins. When he leaned in and kissed her, it was slow, deep, and filled with a longing that left Amara breathless. He lifted her effortlessly, carrying her inside to the master suite, where the soft glow of the moonlight spilled across the large bed. The moment felt inevitable, the perfect culmination of their intense, building connection. But as he gently laid her down, his lips trailing softly along her jawline, Amara's heart began to pound with a different kind of urgency. She placed a gentle, trembling hand against his chest, stopping him. Tae-jin froze instantly. The heavy haze of desire in his dark eyes cleared, immediately replaced with concern. He pulled back just enough to look at her face, reading her expression with the sharp intuition that kept him alive in his dangerous world. "Tae-jin," Amara whispered, her voice steadying as she looked up into his intense gaze. "There is something I need to tell you, something I should have mentioned before we came here." He shifted his weight, giving her space, his complete attention locked onto her words. "You can tell me anything, Amara." She took a deep breath, the vulnerability of the moment washing over her. "My entire life has been about survival, building my business and protecting my heart. I have never allowed myself to be swept away, and I have never shared myself in this way. I need you to know that I am someone who has known no man." Tae-jin went completely still. In his world, innocence was a myth, something lost long before adulthood. To hear that this brilliant, successful, independent woman had guarded her heart and her body so fiercely moved him in a way he couldn't entirely articulate. "I care for you deeply," Amara continued, her hand still resting over his racing heart. "But I have always made a promise to myself. I have always dreamed that I would only give myself completely on my wedding night to the man who chooses me for a lifetime. I would love getting to know my first man on my wedding night and not a moment before." Silence stretched in the dimly lit room. For a man who was accustomed to taking whatever he desired, the world expected him to be frustrated, but Tae-jin felt an overwhelming surge of reverence. He looked at the woman beneath him, seeing the fierce strength it took to hold on to her values, and he realized right then that he didn't just want a fleeting romance with Amara, he wanted to protect her light. Tae-jin slowly leaned down and pressed a soft, lingering kiss to her forehead. "You are the most extraordinary woman I have ever met," he murmured, his warm, strong voice thick with profound respect. He rolled to the side, pulling the luxurious sheets over them both, and then carefully drew her into his arms, simply holding her against his side. "Your heart is safe with me, Amara, and your promise is my promise now." They spent the rest of their first night wrapped in each other's embrace, talking until the sun began to rise over the Indian Ocean, their bond forging into something unbreakable. The morning sun filtered through the sheer curtains of the Maldivian villa, casting a warm, golden glow over the room. Amara woke up to the steady, rhythmic beating of Tae-jin's heart beneath her cheek. He was already awake, his arm wrapped protectively around her, his dark eyes looking down at her with an expression of profound peace. The night before could have been the end of their story, a clash of entirely different worlds and expectations. Instead, it became the foundation of something far more extraordinary. That morning marked the beginning of an incredible chapter in their lives. Unwilling to part ways and return to the rigid demands of their respective empires, they made a silent pact to carve out a new reality. They packed their lives into briefcases and secure encrypted laptops, deciding that their boardrooms and syndicates would simply have to adapt to their movement. They went on traveling the world together. For months, the glow became their shared sanctuary, a vast canvas where they painted the growing depth of their love while honoring the boundary Amara had set. In the snowy peaks of the Swiss Alps, they spent weeks secluded in a mountainside chalet. While the blizzard raged outside, they sat by roaring fires, negotiating international deals on separate encrypted lines. Amara would hear the chilling, authoritative tone Tae-jin used to command his lieutenants, a stark reminder of the dark, dangerous underworld he ruled. Yet, moments later, he would turn to her, his voice softening entirely as he handed her a mug of hyploco. They slept in the same bed every night, wrapped tightly in each other's arms, sharing breathless kisses and whispered secrets in the dark. But they maintained the sacred promise they had made. They traveled the world together without having anything together physically beyond that line. Spring found them in the vibrant, bustling streets of Kyoto. They walked hand in hand beneath falling cherry blossoms, the lethal shadows of Tae-jin's unseen security detail blending perfectly into the crowds. They learned the intricate maps of each other's minds. Amara learned about his turbulent rise to power, the heavy burdens of loyalty and survival that came with leading a mafia family. Tae-jin learned about the sheer grit and determination it took for a brilliant black woman to shatter glass ceilings and build a corporate legacy from the ground up. The restraint they practiced only heightened their emotional intimacy. Every touch of a hand, every lingering gaze across a crowded restaurant was charged with an electric, simmering anticipation. Summer swept them to the sun-drenched cliffs of the Amalfi Coast. They chartered a private yacht, sailing across the azure waters of the Mediterranean. They spent hours debating philosophy, business strategies, and their hidden fears. Tae-jin, a man whose entire life had been defined by immediate gratification and the absolute taking of power, found a strange, beautiful liberation in the wait. He realized that holding back, savoring the slow burn of their emotional connection, was the most profound discipline he had ever practiced. Amara was not a prize to be won or a conquest to be claimed. She was his equal, his sanctuary, and the only peace his turbulent soul had ever known. Autumn brought them to the sweeping savannas of the Serengeti. Beneath an endless canvas of stars, surrounded by the raw, untamed wilderness, they sat on the terrace of their luxury lodge. The stillness of the African night wrapped around them. Tae-jin looked at Amara, her face illuminated by the soft glow of a lantern. She was laughing at something he had said, her eyes sparkling with a joy that reached the very depths of her soul. It hit him then, with the force of a tidal wave. He didn't just want to travel the world with her. He didn't just want to protect her. He wanted to be the man who stood by her for the rest of their lives. He wanted to be the one to fulfill her lifelong dream and give her the moment she had waited 30 years for. Tae-jin reached across the small table, his strong, calloused hand enveloping hers. The laughter faded from Amara's lips, replaced by a soft, questioning breath as she met his intense, unwavering gaze. The air between them shifted, heavy with the weight of an impending promise, signaling that their global journey of waiting was finally drawing to its beautiful, inevitable close. The silence of the Serengeti was broken only by the distant, rhythmic sounds of the wildlife. But to Tae-jin, the only sound that mattered was the sudden, sharp intake of Amara's breath. He held her hand firmly, his thumb gently tracing the smooth skin of her knuckles. The realization that had just hit him was absolute and unshakable. He had spent his entire life commanding armies in the shadows, building an empire of fear and respect. But looking at Amara, he knew his greatest legacy would be the love he gave to her. He smoothly pushed his chair back and lowered himself to one knee right there on the wooden terrace under the vast African sky. Amara gasped, her eyes widening in pure astonishment as the formidable Mafia boss looked up at her with an expression of complete, unguarded devotion. He didn't pull out a velvet box or a diamond just yet. He simply offered her his heart. He told her that before she walked onto that beach in South Korea, he had only known how to conquer the world, but she had taught him how to actually live in it. He spoke of the months they had spent traveling, the beautiful agony of waiting, and the profound respect he held for the promise she had made to herself. He told her he wanted to be the man who granted her that wish, not just for one night, but for the rest of their days. When he finally asked her to be his wife, Amara didn't just say yes. She threw her arms around his neck, tears of sheer joy streaming down her face, pulling him into a fiercely passionate kiss that seals their future. Neither of them wanted a long engagement. They had waited long enough. Within weeks, they returned to South Korea, where Tae-jin's vast resources orchestrated a wedding that was an absolute masterpiece of privacy and elegance. They chose a secluded, ancient cliff-top estate that belonged to his family, overlooking the very same coastal waters where they had first met. The ceremony was incredibly intimate. Amara's closest family and trusted business partners were flown in on private jets, marveling at the seamless luxury and the heavy invisible veil of security that protected the grounds. Tae-jin's inner circle, men who usually communicated in sharp nods and cold stares, stood in absolute, respectful silence, deeply moved by the sight of their ruthless leader completely disarmed by love. As they exchanged their vows by the edge of the cliff, the ocean breeze carrying their promises into the horizon, they officially became husband and wife. When the sun set and the celebratory toasts concluded, Tae-jin and Amara finally retreated to the master wing of the estate. The heavy oak doors clicked shut, plunging them into a world that belonged entirely to them. For 30 years, Amara had built up the idea of this night in her mind. Naturally, a flicker of nervous anticipation danced in her chest. She was stepping into entirely unknown territory, vulnerable in a way she had never allowed herself to be. But Tae-jin, ever perceptive, read her perfectly. He didn't rush. He didn't let the heavy intensity of his usual demeanor take over. Instead, he simply pulled her into his arms and started swaying with her to a silent song, a soft, teasing smile playing on his lips. He cracked a light-hearted joke about how he had conquered rival syndicates with less nervous energy than he had right now, which made Amara burst into a fit of genuine musical laughter. That laughter shattered the tension instantly. The nervousness evaporated, replaced by a radiant, soaring joy. The night they shared was absolutely spectacular. It was devoid of awkwardness and filled entirely with warmth, exploration, and fun. Tae-jin was infinitely patient, guiding her with a tenderness that made her feel cherished, safe, and wildly desired. They laughed when they tangled in the luxurious silk sheets. They whispered secrets between breathless kisses, and they discovered the pure, unadulterated bliss of a physical connection built on a foundation of profound emotional intimacy. For Amara, getting to know her first man on her wedding night was everything she had ever dreamed of and more. It wasn't just a solemn merging of bodies, it was a celebration. It was playful, passionate, and incredibly liberating. As the hours blurred into morning, they lay wrapped in each other, exhausted but overflowing with a profound sense of completeness. The wait, which had spanned across continents and tested their endurance, had blossomed into a reward far greater than either of them could have ever imagined. The months that followed their spectacular wedding night were a masterclass in merging two formidable lives into one seamless reality. Amara and Tae-jin returned to their respective empires, but the dynamic had fundamentally shifted. They were no longer two solitary leaders bearing the weight of the world alone. They were an unstoppable partnership. Amara's corporate headquarters and Tae-jin's heavily guarded executive offices became interconnected strongholds. They shared quiet breakfasts before sunrise, strategized over evening teas, and always ended their days wrapped in the profound, passionate intimacy they had so patiently waited for. Life was beautifully chaotic, demanding, and deeply fulfilling. Then, as the seasons began to change, a new, gentle rhythm interrupted their fast-paced world. Amara first noticed the subtle shifts, a sudden exhaustion after brief meetings, a newfound sensitivity to the rich aromas of her favorite morning coffee. When the confirmation finally came, she stood in the opulent master bathroom of their Seoul estate, staring at the small device in her hand, tears of sheer disbelief and joy blurring her vision. When she told Tae-jin that evening, the reaction of the feared, untouchable syndicate boss was something out of a profoundly moving painting. The man who commanded thousands, who never flinched in the face of danger, dropped completely to his knees. He pressed his face against her stomach, his broad shoulders trembling as he wrapped his arms around her waist. In that singular moment, the shadows of his past melted away, completely eclipsed by the blinding light of the future they were creating together. The pregnancy was a whirlwind of fierce protection and overwhelming tenderness. Tae-jin immediately restructured his operations, pulling himself further away from the dangerous front lines of the underworld and solidifying his position strictly as a corporate CEO. His entire focus shifted to creating an impenetrable, safe haven for his growing family. He attended every single medical appointment, his sharp, intimidating days analyzing ultrasound monitors with the same intensity he usually reserved for rival syndicates. Amara, in turn, learned to delegate her corporate responsibilities, allowing herself to soften into the experience of bringing new life into the world. Summarizing those 9 months would be a tale of absolute devotion. Tae-jin transformed from a lethal shadow to a man who spent his evenings reading storybooks to Amara's growing belly and rubbing her aching feet, while Amara glowed with a radiant maternal strength that only deepened his reverence for her. When the day finally arrived, the sprawling private wing of the best hospital in the city was secured with an invisible fortress of loyal men. Inside the delivery room, the world outside ceased to exist. Through the exhaustion, the pain, and the overwhelming surge of adrenaline, Amara held tightly to Tae-jin's hand. He never left her side, whispering words of endless encouragement and love in both English and Korean. And then, the room filled with the sharp, beautiful cry of new life. It was a baby girl. When the nurses finally placed the tiny, swaddled bundle into Amara's arms, the breath caught in her throat. Her daughter had her rich, glowing complexion and Tae-jin's striking dark eyes. Tae-jin leaned over them, one large, protective hand gently cradling the back of the baby's head. For a man who had seen the darkest corners of humanity, looking at her perfect, innocent daughter brought a silent stream of tears down his face. Amara looked up from their beautiful baby girl to the man who had completely changed her life. She thought back to the solitary years of building her empire, the fierce guarding of her heart, and the unwavering promise she had made to herself to wait for the exact right moment and the exact right man. She thought of the months they spent traveling the globe, honoring her boundaries, building a foundation of unbreakable trust. Looking at her husband, whose eyes held nothing but absolute adoration for his family, and feeling the warm weight of her daughter resting against her chest, a profound sense of peace settled over her soul. Every lonely night, every challenge, every single moment of anticipation had led her precisely to this room, to this life. It was all worth the wait. The sprawling estate on the cliffs of South Korea had once been a fortress of silence and shadows, a place where the heavy burdens of a syndicate were carried. Now, 3 years later, those shadows had been completely chased away by the bright, echoing sound of a toddler's laughter. Amara stood by the grand glass doors of the terrace, a warm cup of tea resting in her hands, watching the scene unfold on the manicured lawn. Her daughter, a boundless ball of energy with a crown of thick, dark curls and eyes that held the universe, was currently running in joyful, uneven circles. Chasing closely behind her was Tae-jin. The man whose mere name once made the most ruthless men in the country tremble was now happily jogging across the grass, purposely slowing his long strides to let his little girl win. When he finally caught her, he scooped her high into the air, and the booming, genuine laughter that erupted from his chest filled the coastal breeze. A profound warmth bloomed in Amara's chest. Over the past 3 years, their lives had transformed in ways she could never have fully anticipated. Tae-jin had systematically and ruthlessly dismantled the illegal factions of his syndicate. He had leveraged his vast resources to transition his empire entirely into legitimate global logistics and real estate. It was a massive, dangerous undertaking, but he had executed it with the precision of a man who had everything to lose and everything to protect. He refused to let his daughter grow up in a world where she had to look over her shoulder. He was now strictly a corporate CEO, his dark past locked securely away, replaced by the unbreakable shield of a devoted father and husband. Amara, too, had evolved. Her corporate empire had flourished beyond her wildest dreams. The merger that had originally brought her to South Korea was now a cornerstone of the global market. But the frantic survivalist energy that used to drive her had softened into a deep, grounded confidence. She no longer had to fight every battle alone. She had a true partner, an equal, who championed her brilliance and guarded her peace. Leaving the glass doors behind, Amara stepped out onto the terrace. Tae-jin caught sight of her, his entire demeanor softening as he walked over, their daughter resting comfortably on his broad hip. The little girl immediately reached out her small hands, babbling excitedly, and Amara took her into her arms, pressing a soft kiss to her warm, sun-kissed cheek. Tae-jin wrapped his arms around them both, pulling Amara back against his chest. He rested his chin on the top of her head, the three of them looking out over the exact same stretch of ocean where they had first crossed paths. The waves crashed against the rocks in a steady, eternal rhythm, exactly as they had on that fateful evening. "I was just thinking," Amara murmured softly, leaning her weight back into his solid frame, "about the woman I was when I first walked on that beach. I was so guarded, so convinced that giving any part of myself away meant losing my power." Tae-jin's arm tightened around her waist. His deep voice resonated against her back, filled with the quiet, unyielding devotion that had become the foundation of their lives. "You didn't lose your power, Amara. You just taught me how to find mine." The baby soon grew heavy-eyed, lulled to sleep by the rhythm of their parents' voices and the sea breeze. After they tucked her into her nursery, lingering just to watch the gentle rise and fall of her chest, Tae-jin led Amara back to their master suite. The room was bathed in the soft golden light of the setting sun, a tranquil sanctuary far removed from boardrooms and the demands of the world. He pulled her gently into a dance, swaying slowly without any music, just as he had done on their spectacular wedding night. There was a beautiful familiarity to the way they moved together now, an intimate knowledge of each other's minds and bodies that only came from deep, unconditional trust. Amara rested her cheek against his chest, listening to the steady heartbeat that had been her anchor across continents. She thought about the fierce vow she had made to herself as a young woman, the quiet dignity of waiting, and the absolute beauty of finding a man who didn't just respect her boundaries, but worshipped the strength it took to hold them. She had dreamed of a perfect wedding night with her first and only man, but she had never dared to dream of the spectacular life that would follow. Tae-jin gently lifted her chin, his dark eyes reflecting a love so profound it still took her breath away. He leaned down, capturing her lips in a slow, searing kiss that held the same electric spark as their very first night on the private island, only now it was enriched by years of shared triumphs, late-night whispers, and the beautiful chaos of building a family. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting their world in shades of violet and gold, Amara knew with absolute certainty that the journey was complete. She had protected her heart through the hardest years of her life, and it had led her directly into the arms of a man who would spend the rest of his days making sure she never had to face the world alone again. The empires they built would outlast them, and the wealth they accumulated was vast. But as they held each other in the quiet safety of their home, they both knew they had already secured the only treasure that truly mattered. They protected their peace and found each other in the process. If this gave you butterflies, like. If it made you believe in love again, comment. If you want more stories like this, subscribe and turn on notifications.